Hi, I'm Chris Bishop. Welcome to Captains of Industry. This week we bring you the man at the helm of Africa's biggest satellite broadband service, YahClick. His name is Farhad Khan. He has 25 years experience in the business and an MBA from the University of Cape Town, plus quite a story to tell about his industry. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just give us a sketch at the top of the size and the dominance of your company in Africa.
So YahClick is owned by Yahsat, but YahClick is a joint venture between Yahsat and Hughes. Hughes in America and globally as well are the world leaders for satellite internet broadband technology. So we've got a joint venture for Africa, the Middle East and Southwest Asia, where we're partners. But YahClick is the majority share. The majority shares are owned by Yahsat, which is a Mubadala company. Mubadala is a global investment house based out of Abu Dhabi, and they're the majority shareholders of Yahsat.
And give us an idea of size and scale, number of customers, the amount of turnover you have.
So we've got in excess of well, we don't really count customers in subscriber terms because we are resellers. We sell to people who have their own subscriber bases. So what we call them is partners. So most of the time, sometimes we do have visibility of the subscribers they have, sometimes not. But we would estimate that we're between 15 and 20,000 throughout the world. Africa, we would estimate it be about 7,000 to 8,000. We're not sure. Once again, just bear in mind how the technology works. I would sell to you bulk capacity. You then on-sell to your subscribers. So I don't really have visibility of the total subscribers you've connected.
So let's go right back to the beginning, as I always like to on Captains of Industry. Back to your roots. You grew up in a place called Richmond in KwaZulu-Natal, a small little village and town. Just tell us a little bit about your upbringing there.
Oh, I guess everyone's eyes light up when they talk about their childhood, because our childhoods are always better than the childhoods that are currently that people are experiencing. But yeah, I mean, I think we had a beautiful childhood. It wasn't easy by any means. Richmond is a small village. I grew up at the height of apartheid, and but because we didn't know better, the education we got was good enough, and I believe it held us in good stead. We didn't have access to universities or anything in that area, so we had to go out. I actually ended up leaving Richmond quite early, and I became a fax technician, worked for a company called Nashua. Great days. That was my introduction to telecommunications, understanding how modems and communication protocols worked.
But just, I mean, before you left, I mean, your mother and father, they're obviously, and your father in particular, you said that he was an influence on you in the eventual business that you turned to make your money from. In what way? I mean, what was your father? Who was he? What did he do?
So my father had a very interesting job. He was a radio technician for a forestry company called Seligna Forestry, which was ultimately bought out by SAPI. And in the days that there were no cell phones, they had to ensure that the forests didn't burn down. And they would erect these massive towers in the middle of every forest. And his job, there was a radio, a two-way radio in every tower. And his job was physically to climb up those towers, make sure the radios are working, because if the radios worked by relay, so if the guys, and they manned it 24 hours, if they saw a fire, they would by relay call the next radio, because it was line of sight, until they got hold of the fire services to come and put the fire out. Otherwise there was thousands and hundreds of thousands of damage to the forest. And my father was in charge of maintaining the radios. So I got to understand technology and electronics looking over his shoulder while he repaired these radios. And he was patient enough to answer all my silly questions about what a transistor did and a capacitor. And in those days, those were the components that made up a radio.
And you said when times were hard and you were growing up, your mother, she was a housewife, but she also used to go and sell roti and what have you in the village to keep the family together.
But that was village life, right? Everybody was an entrepreneur. The neighbors sold samosas and the other neighbors sold milk, and we all made do. You know, the one salary was very seldom enough in a household. So we'd supplement it. My mother would sell vegetables in the village, make rotis for people. But it was great memories, great times, right?
And then, still a world away from the internet, you got your first job working with fax machines.
Yeah, I worked for Nashua in Pietermaritzburg, but there was an amazing exposure to how communications actually work, because this was the advent of fax machines. People couldn't believe that you'd put a piece of paper onto a platen and 1,000 miles away the exact same paper would come out. And that mesmerized me, and I wanted to understand exactly how that worked. So I read every book possible on how fax machines worked, and it held me in good stead, because when it came to repairing them, because I knew how they worked, I could fix them up. So that was a great introduction to telecommunications.
And then how many years did you do that before the internet came along, and what was your first encounter with the internet?
I worked for Nashua for about 4 years, then moved on to Gestetner, but doing a similar job in Johannesburg, where I used to be a product manager. My first introduction to the internet was when I joined Telkom, and they formed the first ISP that sort of sold commercial internet services to customers in South Africa through a company called Intercom. And I was working for Telkom at the time, and obviously I was one of the first subscribers. I think I still have my username, it's Telkom121. And that was my first introduction to the internet.
So just tell me a bit about those early days. I mean, a good friend of mine, he was one of the pioneers of the internet here, and he told me two things. He said, he'd fix people up with their internet address, and the guys would say, like, so who can I send an email to? And the guy was, that's all right, send it to me. Number one. And then he said after a week, sometimes they'd ring him up and say, listen, the internet's broken. What do I do? And as you know, it wasn't. But what was your experience?
Well, I'll tell you, being a young man, always obsessed with speed, the overriding point for us was what was the fastest modem we could get. If you had a 14,400 or 28,800 or 56.6, you were really fast, right? So that was my experience with it.
And it was all, in those early days, it was just like ages to download things. I mean, movies and things, forget it. What's your memory of those times, those early days when everyone was bumbling around with the internet?
The worst part was halfway through the month and your line got cut because you haven't paid it. And the sweetest sound you'd ever hear was when the line was reconnected and you got the modem protocol sound, that whistling sound. Mm-hmm. That had to have been the sweetest sound you'll ever hear.
And then you did some years at Telkom. And then you decided to prepare yourself for management, and you did an MBA at the University of Cape Town. But for you, it wasn't as easy as it is for some people who do MBAs later in life. You had to finance your way through.
I quit work at the early or ripe old age of 31. And at the age of 32, I completed the MBA through Cape Town, University of Cape Town full-time. But I worked at the Hugo Boss and the Grey shop at the waterfront. And that salary that I used to earn from the Sultis actually funded my expenses, petrol, tuition, and everything else.
So selling suits, what did it teach you that you can use today in the internet business?
The best lesson about selling a suit is get a guy to try it. Because once he looked at himself in the mirror, it was a sure sale.
Is that it?
That's it.
Just it's all to do with ego.
Get him to try.
And it must have been some stories there, though. Sometimes selling those suits, Hugo Boss, etc. And it was boom times, arguably, when you were doing it for this country, say 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. And what stories do you have about selling suits in those days?
Well, bear in mind, I used to take the graveyard shift, right? I was on from 5 o'clock in the evening till 9:30 or 10 at night. And sometimes you'd be doing nothing for 3 or 4 hours, and there'd be some conference in Cape Town. I can't mention the captains of industries' names at that time, but they'd walk into the shop and you're all bored and you think, okay, another customer. But they'd end up buying 15, 20,000 rands at that time, which was a fortune.
Money, yeah.
And it didn't happen once or twice. It was actually fairly frequent. So those were the highlights. We'd look forward to that. A Saturday or a Sunday was interesting because at that time there was this massive influx of tourists, Germans, French, European mainly, coming to Cape Town. And for them, the price of a Hugo Boss or a Carducci suit was really reasonably priced compared to the European markets, and they'd buy a lot. So we'd always look forward to a person with a foreign sounding accent and just follow him around as he walked into the shop.
But it must be quite interesting now. I mean, obviously you're a captain of industry now. You go and buy your own suits, and you know all the tricks, I assume, once you get in there.
Don't let the guy stand behind you and pull it tight.
But then you got finally you joined MTN, if I recall.
I joined Accenture first.
Accenture.
As a strategy consultant for telecommunications.
Yeah, and then MTN, and you went all over the world. What was that like?
I was fortunate. Joined MTN at the stage when they were still growing. They only had 2 or 3 markets in Africa. So it was a learning curve for everybody. But we all bought into the philosophy of with great risk comes great rewards, and that's vindicated itself 1,000,000 times over for MTN. So I was very fortunate. I was deployed in a lot of the startups. My first massive opportunity was to go and head up marketing and customer care in Iran, and we did that for just over 2 years. We built a business from almost nothing. 5 people were sent from the African operations, actually, and the day that I left, we were over 2,000.
Really?
Yes,
and what was it like building something from scratch in Iran, a young man from Richmond in KwaZulu-Natal? How did you approach it?
You know, we couldn't be reflective about it because you were in the trench. We had a deadline of launching in 9 months. The pressure was on. So we couldn't be introspective or reflective about it. We just had to wake up in the morning, get the list of tasks that needed to be done, and just do it. We worked 7 days a week for almost 2 years. But I believe that team had massive, massive success because it's today, I may be mistaken, I'm not really in touch with MTN anymore, but I think it's the 2nd largest operation in their portfolio. So a really worthwhile investment.
Well, excellent. Well, we're going to be talking a lot more about your business in the second half. You're watching Captains of Industry. I'm Chris Bishop. I've been speaking to Farhad Khan, the Captain of Industry and Guiding Spirit at YahClick, the biggest satellite broadband provider in Africa. We're going to be talking a lot more about the industry and its challenges in the second half. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Captains of Industry. I'm Chris Bishop, and we've had a fascinating first half here. We're talking to Farhad Khan from YahClick. He's had more than 25 years in the business, and he's currently the head of the biggest satellite internet provider broadband provider, in Africa. So just give us a sketch at the top of the show here. Your market, what kind of people are they, and what sort of situation is it where your biggest demand is? So
Chris, we call ourselves HTS, which is high throughput speed, but it's essentially broadband internet through the satellite as a medium. Just to share with you, you get different medium types. You've got fiber, you've got GSM, you've got ADSL. So satellite's just another alternative. What we have as a massive strength is the fact that our infrastructure is already deployed. So we have coverage of over 28 countries in Africa without laying a single piece of pipe or cable or fiber or copper in the ground. And that latent connectivity capability is already up there. We've invested in it. So typically, our boast is that wherever you need high-speed internet connectivity, you can get it, regardless of whether there's fiber there or whatever technology. Our technology is standalone. Typically, we prefer to go for what we call the people who are underserved and unserved. They've got absolutely no options. They've got no alternatives, no substitute products, and that's a really good market for us because they're not as price sensitive. Having said that, though, we believe that our product has moved from specialty to mainstream. And in the coming few days, we're going to be speaking about our partnership in South Africa with YahClick as an example. all our endeavors to get our product into the mainstream, we believe that we're entitled to as much a share of the market as whether it's the GSM, the ADSL providers, because our technology is robust enough to compete with those. So back to your question, typically, our primary market are the small businesses and high-end households who have need for critical communications. Hotel industry, B&B, hospitals, clinics, schools, farmers, hunters. So people predominantly in the areas that have fringe coverage or no coverage. And you'll be surprised to know that there's still hundreds of thousands of those areas in South Africa, despite the fact that we've got such ubiquitous GSM coverage. So we go out of our way to understand, and we pay a lot for the research to identify where these customers are, not just for South Africa, but for almost every market in Africa. So we've got empirical research from multiple sources to tell us exactly where the markets are that don't have fiber, GSM, ADSL. For South Africa being one of the 3 key markets in Africa for us, our ambition is to partner with the company that we've just announced at Africa.com called YahClick to actually accelerate the growth of internet.
So you're going for a mass market now, the ordinary person on the street, shall we say, rather than the high customers who isolated from satellite broadband at the moment. Is that who you're going for?
Correct.
Yeah.
Whilst our primary focus will always be people who don't have connectivity as a primary, we believe that our product is well enough priced to now compete with mainstream.
But having said that, presumably you're offering a lower price for people who are closer to the technology.
No, we don't discriminate.
Okay, it'll be the same price.
Yeah, so what we do is we've mapped out all the pricing for all the competitors in the country. We cannot be cheaper than everybody else, but we definitely play within the mainstream and the bell curve of all the pricing opportunities we have.
So you said farmers and hoteliers, people out in the bush, unconnected, but these new people, I mean, who are these? Are these guys who work in petrol stations, or what sort of people are we talking about?
So that's a perfect lead into where our technology is going, Chris, because previously VSAT technology or satellite technology was seen as quite a barrier because it was expensive and it was susceptible to weather deterioration. But I'd like to say that in the last 4 to 5 years, the leaps and bounds in technology that have been made, especially for HTS, which is our satellite technology, has been amazing. I mean, we can do VoIP calls on our technology and you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference from a normal circuit switched call. The point being that this growth and advent of technology has also made it substantially more affordable. So previously, to get the dish and the customer equipment would cost you in excess of $500, sometimes $1,000 for our technology. Today, we can give it to you at about $200. And we go one step further. With the partnerships that we have, if you take a 1-year or 2-year contract, we actually amortize the equipment over a period of time, so you pay nothing.
So what sort of speeds are we talking about with this new operation? We
can get up to 25 megs per second for a basic household environment. Definitely there are some enterprise type applications which would need more, and we can find a way to tandem them and go up to 50 megs depending on the situation and the context. Primarily though, we look at single use environments, typically high-speed internet broadband where it's mission critical. They want to do a bit of VoIP, or voice over IP, and our service is actually well geared towards all of that video downloading, streaming. Our services are perfect. I'd like to, if you don't mind, speak a little bit about the change we've made in our technology. We now have the Express Wi-Fi product. What this means is we believe it's actually the next curve. Specifically for people who cannot afford the dish and the kit for $200 or a monthly cost, okay? We've got a prepaid type offering. So we're going to be rolling out Wi-Fi hotspots throughout South Africa, especially in areas where there's no coverage, or if there is coverage, the coverage quality is very poor. And people can literally go up to a vendor, purchase a voucher, and enjoy the internet for 1, 2, 3, 24 hours at 25 megs per second, which I challenge any of the existing DSL or GSM providers to match.
And how many countries are we talking about in Africa where this will be rolled out?
In all 28 countries.
Okay, that you cover. Okay, what kind of support have you been getting from government for these things? I mean, the government's always talking about these initiatives to get broadband to the people, to help entrepreneurs, but what kind of support have you had from them?
You know, the governments in Africa have, in the last 2 years, been very supportive because there's quite an endeavor to get connectivity out into the rural areas. Whilst we don't partner directly with the governments, we believe that we empower through partnerships within the countries. We have partnerships in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, our primary markets, to actually roll out connectivity in these rural areas. So in South Africa, we've been involved through other partners like Vox with schools. In Nigeria, we've been involved with schools and rollouts. In Kenya, we've been doing schools and clinics. So we are getting, there's this massive awakening and impetus towards connectivity. And you know, there's this World Bank study that was done a few years ago that says that for every 10% of internet broadband growth in a country, you enjoy maybe 1.3, 1.5% growth in GDP, which is real. We've seen it actually happen.
Mm-hmm. So, and competition on the continent? I mean, how many companies are there like yourself who are fighting for this? What's ever going to be a growing market? I can't see it ever diminishing, bearing in mind how many people need to be still connected.
Long may it be like that. There are a few. We've got a few European, British operators that operate on the continent. But we don't believe that they're our competition. We believe that our competition are the mainstream telecommunications providers, because with the speeds that we offer, at the price we offer, that should be our competition. The difference between the way we go to market and the way other players go to market is that we prefer to be a lot more intimate with the market itself.
So what kind of disruption is heading to your business at the moment, here we sit in 2019?
So first and foremost for us is this ability to offer a voucher in the middle of nowhere to a person who wants to use the internet. And we've seen, I mean, just to quote figures, in Nigeria, they've got one of the biggest internet penetrations as a percentage of the population. They're about 60, 65%. Kenya's at almost 90%, South Africa's 56%, which means that the previous excuse of lack of education, lack of knowledge means nothing. It means that people will overcome their lack of understanding of being able to spell things in the traditional way, but to get onto the internet and talk, leave a voice message on WhatsApp, you don't need education for that. And we've seen that prevalence, and we've seen that growth on the internet. We've seen that the biggest application being Facebook, people don't need to understand a language specifically to get access to look at their loved ones, to look at the people who are working in the towns. So that growth, that I would call it a renaissance, has actually spurred on this need for having what we would call sachet type connectivity. And a sachet type connectivity could cost you 20 cents, 30 cents for 10, 15, 20 minutes of internet access. There's not many people who can offer that kind of disruption.
In terms of regulation, I mean, I know all the countries, you said you're in more than 20 countries up and down Africa. I know a lot of them have their own different rules, their own different regulations. How do you deal with that?
So the 28 countries we operate in Africa, first and foremost, we are very, very cognizant of all the regulations for every country. What we do not do is go direct to the market, because that would mean we'd have to get a license. We have primary partners, secondary partners in every country, and the prerequisite, we have a really stringent screening process on the financial viability, the commercial capability, but most importantly, are they licensed, and have they undertaken the obligations necessary for that license. So during that screening process, we make sure that our partners have the relevant licenses, then we support them in the growth in that relevant country.
Okay, and finally, just looking to the future now, I mean, what do you plan for the future? We were talking before the show about Richmond. It could have been that book, How Green Was My Valley. It's where you grew up. I mean, did you ever think of doing a little entrepreneurial project back home or not, as you get older and, you know, towards near the end of your career?
It would be a beautiful closing of the circle if one of my childhood friends in Richmond actually bought one of my products, wouldn't it?
It would be. Do you ever have any thoughts like that? Or?
Well, I'm hoping that with the partnership we've just announced with YahClick, because the main objective of the partnership is to get the products out into every part of the country. And they've got the scale and reach to do it. So yeah, hopefully I can get our product to Richmond.
Well, it would close the circle, wouldn't it? And a long journey that's, well, it's been more than 30 years. Thank you very much indeed for coming on to the show. That's Farhad Khan, the head and captain of industry on YahClick, the biggest satellite broadband provider in Africa. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in this edition of Captains of Industry. For me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.